So we've written a lot of code and we're moving quickly. And what I want to do is just take a step back and go through the code that we've written so far. We started everything in an index.js. Inside of this .env config, this first line of code is loading any environment variables onto process.env. Remember, we're going to use that specific variable called secret key. That's what we loaded. This is something that we want to make sure that no one has access to. And when working with other developers, we'd tell them, hey, you need to make a .env file with that key of secret key. Or maybe we'd even give them a sample one to start with. Right over here, we're bringing in our necessary dependencies. Express and invoking it. CORS for cross-origin resource sharing. This is going to be important when we start making requests from another domain. That could be localhost 3000 or 4000. Different port number violates the same origin policy, a really important concept in web security that I've linked to previously. Body parser is going to allow us to get data from a form via a post, and error handler and auth routes are coming from handler's error and routes auth. Well, what is error handler? This is our nice generic piece of middleware that simply returns a nicely formatted object. This object will always have a key of error and a value of message, and will always get some kind of string, either the message that is being sent from an error passed to it, or just something that says, oops, something went wrong. This is really helpful at the very end of our code, before we start the server, to simply say, no matter what error you send, let this function handle it. That could be a 404, that could be a 400, a 500. We simply just want one standard way to respond with an error. You might not see the total value of this now. It's going to be really nice when we start making AJAX calls, and if something goes wrong, our entire error object always looks the same. This is something where backend developers can make the lives of front-end developers much, much easier by doing these little things. You want to try to not be in a situation where you're doing lots of work on the front end, changing responses from the server to kind of fit this format that you want. So we're going to try to make our future selves be happier. We're going to make future developers that work with us happier. And if you're a backend developer, this will make front-end developers much happier. What we then did is started to work on our user model. You've seen a lot of this code before, bringing in Mongoose, creating a schema, the fields that we need, some validations like required and unique, and then a little bit of Mongoose middleware. Right before we save, make sure that we have actually modified the password, and if not, keep moving. Hash the password, set it to be that password for the user document, and then move on. If anything goes wrong, send it to the error handler. This next function right here is an easy way to compare some kind of password that we'll get from a form or a JSON request, and with whatever is inside of the database. This is going to be really helpful when we try to see if a user has put in the correct password when logging in. And no matter what, this returns a Boolean right here, true or false. If we take a look at this, later on, it's going to be true if the user has put in the correct username and password, or if it's incorrect, it will be false. But if something goes wrong, if there are any kind of errors, move it along to the error handler. It's very easy to just write code like this, but if you're not properly handling errors, you're not really building applications that are ready for production. We then moved on to our handlers. And inside of auth, we started writing the code that simply signed up a user. What does that mean? Well, we created the user, destructured some properties from the document that we got back, and created a token using the JSON Web Token module and our secret key. We then responded with some JSON that included the ID, the username, a profile image URL if they gave us one, and the token. We also added a little bit of logic to make sure that if there are any kind of errors, we'll respond accordingly. What does that mean? Well, the Mongoose errors are a little bit cryptic, but sometimes they'll give you a friendly code. In this case, that is 11000, which specifies that some kind of validation has failed. What do we mean by validation? We mean that when we put something like required and unique, those have passed. So in this case, our auth handler is specifying if you have not specified something that is unique, we're going to say it's already taken. Otherwise, we'll get a nicer error message that says that you've just failed to provide that. We then moved over to our routes. We simply exported the router, which is the result of express.router, and attached onto it our signup handler from handler's auth. Back in our index file, we then included those routes prefixed with /API/auth. How did we test this? Well, back in the terminal, we used HTTPy. And you can take a look pretty easily if you're on Mac, quite a few different ways. If you're on Linux, quite a few different ways as well. So no matter what system you're using, it should be relatively easy to get HTTPy up and running. If you want to use Postman, that's totally fine. So how do we test? Well, I'm going to use HTTP. First, make sure that my server is running. I'm going to use HTTP post to localhost 8081 /API/auth/sign up. And if I do this on its own, I'm going to get a nice object that says user validation failed, password is required, username is required, email is required. Well, let's try to put those in. We'll put in a password of a username of none, and a email of secret@gmail.com. We're just putting in some dummy data to see if this works. And it looks like we're getting back the right information. Notice we didn't get back an error, we got back whatever was sent as the response. What do we mean by that? Well, inside of our handler, inside of auth, we are sending back this right here, res.status of 200.json. If we take a look at what that looks like, back in our terminal, this right here is the ID, that is the token that is generated, this right here is the username, and you might be wondering, well, where's the profile image URL? And that's because I didn't pass in one when I created it. And since that isn't required, we didn't get any kind of error. So it looks like we can successfully create users. What I want to look at in the next section is how to sign up users, and then we'll move on to taking these tokens and making sure that we can successfully create messages. It's where things are going to get even more fun.